Hello and welcome to the Enlightenment Podcast and to our listeners and viewers around the world. Thank you so much for joining us. We feel we're going to do a deep dive here into issues that matter today. And with that in mind, it's important for us to have a dialogue on Palestine at this point, a subject which resonates deeply with both of us, particularly with my wife, who is Palestinian. Our aim is to give a context, an awareness, to maybe fill in the blanks of history that hasn't always been told on mainstream media over the years, and to foster understanding through dialogue and to provide a context. So, that said, let's get into today's podcast and our perspective on how the Palestinian struggle could be exposing the failures, the biases, and perhaps, dare I say it, the double standards of the so-called international world order. Hanan, where do you want to start?
Thanks, Shamim. And just to say and to remind everyone, we're not historians, and Palestine, as Shamim said, is a subject we're passionate about. So Palestine isn't really about just borders and politics. It's about humanity and justice, and whether the global systems are failing to protect the oppressed while at the same time empowering the oppressors, basically.
Always good questions to ask at any time in history, but today we'll just briefly explore the historical roots of this conflict, the ongoing genocide in Gaza, and the complicity, if any, of Western powers. We'll also discuss how Gaza is exposing these double standards and why at this time. We're calling them double standards. You may disagree, but we will explain during this podcast why we think that.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll also look at the role of the international law and how it was created, who it serves really, and why it's very selective in its enforcement, which really undermines its legitimacy, if you like. We'll also address why I believe a two-state solution is no longer viable, and why a single democratic state is the only path to true justice.
Yeah. Well, let's start with a quick whiz back through the history. To understand the present, we have to go back to the late 19th century when European Zionists began a colonial settlement of historic Palestine in 1882.
Yeah, and that's right, Jeremy. And then these Jewish European settlers went to Palestine really with an explicit goal, if you like, of settling and creating a Zionist colony. It was never about coexistence with the indigenous Palestinians.
And that's information that there was no intention of coexisting that we get from the founders of Zionism. And Palestinians had been living on this land for over 4,000 years by this time, building communities, building trade, building culture. We covered quite a bit of how much culture and trade was going on in last week's podcast. The Zionist project was aimed at replacing Palestinians. And as I said, Theodor Herzl was very clear in this when he's considered one of the fathers of Zionism. David Ben-Gurion, similarly, others have made very clear statements about their wish to transform Palestine into an exclusive homeland for the Jews. And exclusive being the operative word, it wasn't somewhere where, as you say, Jews were meant to live side by side with the indigenous population, but to rather remove them.
Yeah, and let's not forget the indigenous Palestinians had no say in this colonial project. They were never part of it. And this was the Zionist project was really built on the idea of removing Palestinians by force. And by the 1920s, we started seeing Zionist terror groups violently attack Palestinian communities, including massacres, which we discussed in previous episodes.
And which are well documented
Yeah.
on by historians on both sides. This violence then escalated considerably between 1947 1948 in the lead up to the Nakba, the catastrophe of 1948, when over 750,000 Palestinians were displaced or expelled or ethnically cleansed in one way or another. And
Yeah.
around 550 villages during this time were destroyed, systematically erased by Zionist militia, and often terrorist groups that were deemed terrorist by the British, in fact, like the Irgun and the Lehi.
Yeah, yeah. And it was really about creating an ethnocracy, if you like. An ethnocracy is a system where one ethnic group dominates other groups.
So obviously an ethnocracy, just by but just by the idea of dominance, isn't a democracy. It prioritizes one group. And in this case of the Zionists, it was Jewish Israelis, while marginalizing and oppressing Palestinians. And this system was embedded from the start and continues today. So
Yeah.
it's the
Yeah.
foundation.
Yeah, very much so. And if we talk about a bit about the international community's role in this, really, just to go back a bit. So the United Nations was established in 1945 after the Second World War, and it replaced the League of Nations, which was established after World War One. So just in 2 years after the UN was established in 1947, they decided to just partition Palestine into, yeah.
Well, I mean, I come my heritage is South African and Indian, so I know colonialism, and it imposed that sounds like an imposed colonial mindset that disregards the right to self-determination. So, just clarify for me, this decision to partition Palestine was made without the consent of the Palestinian people?
Yeah, very much so. So the UN decided to partition and to give 56% of historic Palestine to the Zionists. And even though at the time they owned less than 10% of the land, and that was an increase from earlier on because they were purchasing more and more land. But yeah, despite that, they decided to partition, allocate 56% of Palestine.
Yeah, so that's 10% was owned around, so that makes 46% of land that belonged to somebody else that was just given over. And then in 1948, Zionist forces added to that. They illegally seized 78% of historic Palestine, not 56%. So that's an additional 22% beyond what the UN had allocated. And whether or not you agree with the UN or not, there's still another 22% on top of it.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know if you said vote. They didn't buy it. It was by force. But just to be clear, the UN had no right to make that decision. Palestine didn't belong to the UN or to any other colonial power to partition. It wasn't theirs to give away.
Yeah, and if I'm not wrong, international law supports the right of indigenous people to self-determine, and the partition plan violates that fundamental principle.
Yeah, and yet the international community really remains to this day silent about the additional 22% land that they seized in 1948. But it's not even part of the discussion. We're talking whenever they talk about a peace solution, it's just not even on the horizon of anyone.
Yeah, and then even beyond that, land settlements have now been built on those that remaining little slivers of Palestine. And the fact that settlements have never really been stopped being built or been dismantled with any consistency since Israel was founded really makes me feel like the two-state solution feels like it has been a facade all along in a way, because it feels like all these negotiations were had. We go to even Yitzhak Rabin, and maybe you can correct me on this, but I believe that he did not stop settlements during his tenure. Is that correct?
Yeah, no, the settlements continued throughout under every prime minister.
Even Rabin.
Yeah, especially.
So right, so that was, and I bring that up because to us living in the West, that felt like the acme of when the peace process was happening. There's Rabin on one side and Arafat on the other, but yet settlements were still being built illegally on the remaining slivers of Palestine that were there. So it feels to me like these negotiations were used to buy time to keep expanding the illegal settlements and take over more Palestinian land. And the fourth, whether I'm right or wrong in that assumption, the fourth Geneva Convention prohibits settlement building in occupied territory. So it is, again, another contravention of international law. And it also guarantees the right of indigenous people, as I said before, to self-determination.
Yeah, and international law really is about it's supposed to be the foundation of justice, of accountability in the world. But somehow, when it comes to Palestine, it feels it's just words on paper, ignored whenever it's inconvenient for those Western powers and their allies. And really, let's not forget that international is supposed to be the foundation of a fair world order. But somehow, when it comes to Palestine, that's not really the case.
Give me an example of how you think there's convenience to this. sometimes for the West.
Yeah, I mean, institutions like the ICC, the International Criminal Court, which was established in 2002, were really created to hold war criminals accountable. So, but they've been very selective, turning a blind eye when it comes to Israeli leaders for decades. But this has just recently changed, as we know, this month, or actually November. Now we're in December. And warrants have been issued finally for Netanyahu and Gallant. But America is very much against those warrants and are threatening to all kinds of things. But at the same time, the US was fine when the ICC warrants were issued in other genocides and, in fact, encouraged them, but not when it comes to Palestine and Israel.
Yeah, they were very quick to lend their voice to warrants and ICC action against leaders in the global south or even adversaries like Russia in the current conflict. But when it comes to Israel, it does feel like there's a different standard and there's a selective application of international law or a selective acceptance of international law, especially by the US and sometimes the UK, mostly the UK, which undermines the credibility.
Very much so. And that selective justice, it's really destroying the credibility of international law. So Western governments aren't just really complicit, they're actively supporting and losing credibility, if you like. And not only that, there are at the same time billions in military aid, arms sales, intelligence gathering and sharing, are making them partners in Israel's war crimes and genocide on Gaza.
Yeah, and let's remember that, just one example recently, I think there was a report commissioned by the US and that was presented to Anthony Blinken to say that yes, this was a war crime to be withholding food from people in Gaza. And under that situation, the US is not supposed to then continue to provide weapons to Israel, but it signed off another order right after that. So it's that kind of thing which is a clear double standard, and these things are being reported. They might be low down on your news feeds if you're still watching legacy media, but they're there if you bury and if you look hard enough. But as we're talking about Gaza, let's talk about Gaza. Since October 2023, over 45,000 Palestinians have been killed, including 17,000 children. 17,000 children, over 100,000 Palestinians badly injured and thousands remain buried under the rubble and unaccounted for. These are war crimes to target women and children indiscriminately, and they've been called such by human rights organizations everywhere since this Gaza offensive started. And Israel has even, for an example, killed its own hostages in Gaza. There were 3 people who were waving white flags, Israelis, and they were shot down. So presumably mistaken for Palestinians. So it's not a question of was this really a war crime when people are, with no shirts on, waving white flags, and they still get gunned down. Bad luck that they were Israeli hostages this time, but it just shows that there's an indiscriminate nature to this. Sorry, my speech is nearly over. Gaza.
You're allowed, it's okay.
Gaza has exposed there's a stark, obvious double standard there. It feels like the same countries that lecture the world about human rights and sometimes have a good record on human rights are now completely complicit in Israel's apartheid regime and its genocide against Palestinians.
Yeah, but really, Shamim, just referring to it as a war is really misleading. And I know that's what Western powers and the media, if you like, legacy media does. But in my opinion, it's not a war. It's a genocide. It's not even my opinion. It's now internationally recognized. Um, and really bombing from the air, targeting homes, hospitals, schools. These are deliberate attacks on civilians. I mean, recently doctors who've come back have talked about really assassination techniques, shooting children in the head, and so on, without shrapnel. So, and then the use of white phosphorus in Palestine, in Gaza, and now in Lebanon too. We're seeing it. It's an indiscriminate weapon, really, that burns everything that it touches, and that's another clear violation of international law. And yet, no one really talks about it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, moving from the use of weapons, let's talk about free speech. Because Western democracies champion free speech. But right now they are cracking down on pro-Palestinian voices. Again, something that is not reported often enough in legacy media.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you see it at universities, whether in the US, in Europe, being targeted for peaceful protests, professors losing their jobs, activists being blacklisted. I mean, to give you an example, my aunt Samia Halabi, who's a renowned Palestinian artist, her work is in the Guggenheim and other museums. She had an exhibition that got canceled for speaking out, and by her own alma mater in a US university. And it's really tragic, this level of trying to muzzle anyone who's speaking out, if you like. And yeah.
Yeah, well, definitely feels like a direct contradiction of democratic values that our governments here claim to uphold, because there's a bigger game at play, which is silencing dissent in order to protect Israel's settler colonial agenda. Let's say that that's how it is perceived to people from the outside looking in.
Yeah, very much so. And it also exposes how deeply complicit these nations are. So when you're suppressing free speech at home in your own country and at the same time funding an Israeli apartheid, it's exposing the weaknesses, if you like, and the hypocrisy of international institutions.
Yeah, and we have done an earlier podcast about our view of why this does constitute apartheid. One of the reasons is let's not forget the millions of Palestinian refugees. Another international resolution, UN Resolution 194, guarantees their right to return home to their land. Is that happening?
No. So the Israeli Zionist colony has and continues to refuse allowing Palestinian refugees back. And let's not forget, these Palestinian refugees are scattered all over the diaspora, like someone like my family. Others are in camps in Jordan, in Lebanon, in Syria, all across. And they have every legal and moral right to return, and it's recognized under international law. And yet, since 1948, they haven't been allowed back in to claim their homes, their land, or their right to return, really, to Palestine.
Yeah. And let's remember that the Palestinians who are living in the West Bank, in Gaza, and in East Jerusalem are living under military law. This is the longest running occupation in modern history.
Yeah. Well, it's also, they have to deal with checkpoints, with home demolitions, with arbitrary arrests, with including children. And it's really a daily assault on Palestinians' basic rights. For example, my family, they experience it on a daily basis. It takes some hours to stand in queues like cattle. It's passing through gates, subjugated to humiliation, to rudeness. And really, just to get them from one part of Palestine to another is really hard, and they make it very hard for them if they allow them in the first place to even be able to move from place to place.
Yeah, I remember when we were there to do the TEDx conference. Your cousin Muna and a lot of our other Palestinian speakers were really struggling to get permits. Would have to leave hours and hours ahead just to cross 15 or 20 minutes um, to into Jerusalem. So, for that reason, it seems to me like the two-state solution that keep people occasionally bleat about, once in a while now, is a pipe dream. I mean, if it was a real thing that Israel wanted to have happen, they surely would not be building illegal settlements at a rate of knots. There would not be separate apartheid roads for settlers and demolition of roads for other people. And the blockade of Gaza would not be happening either.
Yeah, yeah. And really, that's why I go back to saying the only viable solution, I feel, is a single democratic state from the river to the sea, one person, one vote, and really with everyone having equal rights, regardless of your ethnicity or religion. That's the only way.
Yeah, and that isn't just idealism, that is actual true democracy, which would dismantle apartheid and ensure justice for refugees and allow everybody to live with dignity. Now, everybody says, well, that's impossible because, these people over here just don't want to deal with those people over there, and and there's extremism, of course, everywhere. But that's, I think, not the point of looking at what the future could be, because one state where everybody is equal, where there is no ethno supremacy for Muslims, for Jews, for Christians, for anybody else, everybody just gets on and lives in their land, is fundamentally decent. It's fundamentally human, and it's right, I think, to start thinking in these terms, because only by having that vision, by that imagination, can you start to sort of, I don't know, move the waves of the world in that way.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, imagine if you're in the States or the UK or Canada and they say, well, only if you're Jewish you can vote, or only if you're black or white or whatever ethnicity will you have equal rights like everyone else. It's just really unfathomable. But anyhow, but until that happens, until there's equality for all, I really do believe that BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions is a powerful nonviolent tool. As you know, Shamima, that worked in South Africa, and I'm sure it'll also work in Palestine.
Yeah, and that involves, because, if you feel, the government is not listening to us, that people, there is a majority, uh, polls tell you there's a majority here and in America who do not think that what is going on is right. There is another way. You can boycott products that are made in Israel, often dates and other agricultural produce. It's just good to check that these are not being created by Israeli settlements from illegal Palestinian land, divesting from companies that are complicit in the occupation, companies that invest in a big way in Israel, and pressuring governments to impose their own sanctions. All of this adds up bit by bit, and it is a way for real democracy, voting with your wallet, to have a bit of a voice.
Very much so. Um, and look, Israel is a Zionist, ethno-supremacist, apartheid colonial project. I know it's a mouthful, but it's about holding them accountable when governments don't, as people, as every day, voting with your wallet, as you said. And BDS is rooted in justice, and it offers everyone a way to really make a difference to the outcome of what they want.
Yeah, and I think this really, it isn't about Palestine only, and I think that's why we've seen people all over the world taking to the streets, still taking to the streets, because it's about humanity. There's a fundamental justice imbalance here. And if we tolerate apartheid and genocide anywhere, we start to betray those values absolutely everywhere. And as you said earlier, without enforcement, international law becomes this meaningless thing. Or even worse, a thing that if is there for powerful nations to ignore those rules when it suits them. And then what's to stop other countries from doing the same? There is a world order there that starts to crumble pretty quickly.
Yeah, and where does that leave us? I mean, without rules, it's chaos, and the very idea of um, a order really depends on everyone being held accountable, not just some, not selectively. If genocide and apartheid are tolerated in Palestine, as we're seeing now, what by the Western governments, I should say, not the people. So what kind of precedence does this set for the rest of the world? Not a good.
Well, I'll tell you. I'll tell you, it tells other oppressive regimes that they can do the same, so long as they have the right allies. Anyway, so, that to me is why enforcing international law is so crucial. It's not just for the Palestinians. Of course, that's important right now, but for everyone. If we don't stand up for justice in this particular thing, it erodes the entire system.
Yeah, and it's as you say, Shamim, it's a failure not only of the legal system, but also there's the moral failure as well. So I don't know how can the international community claim to uphold human rights as they do, as they say this is really their raison d'être, if you like, when it's allowing a genocide to happen and in real time in Gaza.
I think what's interesting about the students that are protesting, and we go past the encampments quite often in central London here, and I know they're happening all over the US. The
Mm.
people who come out week after week to protest, what moves them is that Gaza is like a mirror, and it's showing us the weakness and frankly, the hypocrisy of the current world order. And if democracies are strong, they should be open to criticism. We see in Israel right now, there's a huge push to really get rid of the last remaining bits of media like Haaretz, which is sort of on the left wing. It's a hallmark of fascism, and it's not just failing Palestinians, this kind of push towards creeping fascism. It fails everybody, the whole of humanity. So it's important for us to demand accountability, uh, just to protect the entire concept of justice and fairness.
Yeah, and as you say, Shamim, thankfully young people are not stopping. People in general, I would say, but especially young people, they're waking up, they are making their voices heard, and they're taking action, whether through demos, whether through writing to their representatives, at the encampments, as you mentioned. Yeah, so action is being taken.
Absolutely. And on that positive note, I will say thank you for joining us today for the Enlightenment Podcast. If you found this discussion in any way helpful, meaningful, interesting, please share it. Together we can amplify the voices that need to be heard.
Yeah, thanks, Jimmy. And also remember, silence is complicity. Please stay informed, stay engaged, and take action, most importantly. And thank you for watching, and until the next time.